February 1943. In Berlin, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels declared total war to thunderous applause, promising final victory against the Bolshevik hordes. But in a map room beneath the Reich Chancellery, General Kurt Zeitzler stood before Hitler with a casualty report that made his hands shake. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist, not retreated, not regrouped, ceased to exist. 300,000 men had marched into Stalingrad. 91,000 had just surrendered. The rest were dead or dying in the frozen ruins, and Zeitzler had seen the Soviet strength estimates for the spring offensive. He knew what was coming. He just didn't yet know how to make his Führer understand that the numbers no longer worked, that the mathematics of this war had fundamentally changed, that Germany was now fighting an enemy it could not defeat. The recognition came slowly, unevenly, differently for each man in German high command. It came in stages, like a diagnosis you refuse to accept until the evidence becomes overwhelming. Some saw it at Stalingrad. Others needed Kursk. A few deluded themselves until Soviet tanks rolled through Poland. But between February 1943 and January 1945, every general in the German military leadership went through the same terrible progression, from belief in victory, to hope for stalemate, to desperate attempts to merely survive. What they said during that transformation, in war conferences and private meetings, in letters and diaries and shouted arguments, reveals the slow-motion collapse of a command structure that had once conquered a continent. Zeitzler had been warning Hitler for months. The chief of the Army General Staff was a capable officer who'd earned his position through competence, not party loyalty. He'd watched the supply situation deteriorate throughout the autumn of 1942. He'd seen the intelligence reports showing massive Soviet buildup north and south of Stalingrad. He'd calculated how many divisions Germany had in reserve versus how many the Soviets were massing. The numbers terrified him. In November, when Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus and encircled the Sixth Army, Zeitzler had immediately advocated for breakout. Let them fight their way west while they still had fuel and ammunition. Let them save what could be saved. Hitler had refused. The Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad. Göring had promised the Luftwaffe could supply them by air. It would require 500 tons per day. The Luftwaffe managed an average of 94 tons. Zeitzler had known the mathematics made it impossible, but he'd learned that presenting Hitler with mathematical impossibilities only triggered rage. So he tried different arguments: strategic flexibility, preserving veteran formations, the need for mobile defense. Hitler had dismissed each one. The Sixth Army would hold because he ordered them to hold. When Friedrich Paulus surrendered the remnants of that army on February 2nd, 1943, something broke in Zeitzler. Not his loyalty, not yet, but his belief that rational argument could influence decisions. He'd been right about the supply situation, right about the encirclement danger, right about the need for withdrawal, and 300,000 men had paid for being right while being ignored. In the map room conferences that followed, his presentations grew sharper, more insistent. His staff noticed he'd lost weight. He was sleeping 3 hours a night, smoking constantly, and his hands trembled when he pointed at the maps showing Soviet advances. But Zeitzler still believed the war could be stabilized. That was the first stage of recognition, admitting you'd lost a battle while insisting you could still win the war. He advocated for mobile defense, for trading space for time, for building reserves that could counterattack Soviet breakthroughs. Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, shared this assessment. Manstein was probably the most capable operational commander Germany had. He understood maneuver warfare, how to use interior lines, how to strike at extended Soviet salients. In February and March of 1943, he executed a brilliant counter-offensive, recapturing Kharkov and stabilizing the southern front. It was the last major German victory in the East, and it convinced Hitler that the war was still winnable. That was the fundamental problem German commanders faced. Every time they achieved a tactical success, Hitler interpreted it as validation that willpower and determination could overcome material disadvantage. Manstein had stabilized the front by skillful maneuvering and by concentrating his best divisions at the decisive point. Hitler concluded that standing firm and refusing retreat was the correct strategy. The lesson Manstein tried to teach was that Germany needed to fight a different kind of war now, one based on mobility rather than holding ground. The lesson Hitler learned was that his generals succeeded when they obeyed his orders to never retreat. The next stage of recognition came at Kursk. Operation Citadel, launched in July 1943, was supposed to be Germany's return to offensive warfare. Hitler had delayed it repeatedly, wanting more of the new Panther and Tiger tanks. The delay gave the Soviets time to build the most formidable defensive system in military history. 6 defensive belts, nearly 1 million mines, interlocking fields of fire, and reserves positioned to counterattack any breakthrough. Heinz Guderian, the panzer pioneer who'd been brought back as Inspector General of Armored Troops, had opposed the offensive. He'd examined the intelligence reports on Soviet preparations. He'd calculated the tank strength Germany could commit. 2,700 tanks and assault guns. Impressive, until you realized the Soviets had more than that in reserve alone. Guderian had told Hitler the attack would fail, that the panzer forces needed for Citadel were required to rebuild strategic reserves, that committing them to a frontal assault against prepared defenses was exactly wrong. Hitler had overruled him. The attack would proceed. It had to proceed because Germany needed a victory to restore initiative, to convince wavering allies, to prove the Wehrmacht was still capable of offensive operations. What Germany needed and what Germany could achieve were becoming 2 different things. Guderian was beginning to understand that. Hitler was not. The offensive began on July 5th. Within hours, German commanders knew something was wrong. The Soviets weren't surprised. They weren't retreating in disorder. They were fighting from prepared positions with artillery support that suggested they'd known exactly where the attack was coming. The German advance measured in kilometers per day instead of tens of kilometers. Casualties mounted. Tank losses climbed, and the Soviets kept feeding fresh divisions into the battle. Walter Model, commanding the Northern Pincer, was a tough, aggressive commander who'd earned the nickname Hitler's Fireman for his ability to stabilize crisis situations. 3 days into Citadel, he reported to Hitler that his forces were exhausted, that Soviet resistance was stronger than anticipated, that the offensive was consuming strength faster than it was gaining ground. Hitler had called off Citadel on July 13th, not because of Model's assessment, because the Allies had landed in Sicily and he needed divisions for Italy. The official reason preserved the fiction that Germany had chosen to halt, not failed to break through. But the generals knew. Manstein would later write that Kursk marked the end of German offensive capability in the east. Guderian described it as a complete failure that handed the initiative permanently to the Soviets. Even Hitler seemed to grasp something had changed. He told Guderian after the battle, "Whenever I think of this attack, my stomach turns over." That was as close as the Führer came to admitting error. The summer and autumn of 1943 brought a new kind of warfare to the Eastern Front. The Soviets attacked, the Germans defended, counterattacked when possible, and slowly retreated. It was exactly the mobile defense Manstein had advocated. But Hitler authorized it grudgingly, step by step, always too late. He'd agreed to withdraw from a salient only after the forces there were nearly encircled. He'd permit a retreat only after the defensive line was already breaking. And he'd rage at his generals for abandoning ground, even when holding that ground meant losing the armies defending it. Zeitzler bore the brunt of Hitler's fury. The chief of the general staff attended daily situation conferences where Hitler would spend hours examining maps, questioning casualty figures, demanding explanations for every retreat. Zeitzler's staff noticed he'd developed a nervous tic, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, when Hitler began one of his monologues about willpower overcoming material disadvantage. In September 1943, Zeitzler had presented a comprehensive assessment of force ratios on the Eastern Front. The Soviets had numerical superiority of approximately 3-to-1 in infantry, 3-to-1 in artillery, and 2-to-1 in tanks. Germany was also fighting in Italy and defending against bombing campaigns that were destroying industrial capacity. The Soviet economy, meanwhile, was producing thousands of tanks per month, training hundreds of thousands of replacements, and building artillery parks that dwarfed anything Germany could field. Hitler had dismissed the assessment. Soviet equipment was inferior. Soviet tactics were crude. German soldiers were worth 3 or 4 Russians each. Therefore, the numerical advantage didn't matter. Zeitzler had tried to explain that Soviet equipment had improved dramatically, that the T-34 was now being produced in a version with an 85mm gun that could kill any German tank, that Soviet artillery doctrine was devastatingly effective. Hitler had cut him off. The problem wasn't Soviet strength. The problem was defeatist thinking among the general staff. If his generals believed in victory, they would achieve it. That was when Zeitzler began to understand that rational discussion was impossible. You couldn't convince someone with facts when they decided facts were a conspiracy. He'd tried a different approach, making the tactical arguments Hitler wanted to hear while quietly implementing the strategic withdrawals Germany needed. It was exhausting, deceptive work, and it was slowly killing him. His staff watched him age a decade in a year. The confident officer who'd taken the position in September 1942 had become a haunted man who chain-smoked through conferences and sometimes had to excuse himself to vomit from stress. The winter of 1943 to 1944 brought a new Soviet offensive that drove German forces back across Ukraine. The Wehrmacht was still fighting skillfully, still conducting tactical counterattacks, still making the Soviets pay for every kilometer. But the direction was always west, always retreat. Hitler had created a new rule: no retreat without his personal authorization, which meant every tactical decision required approval from a man hundreds of kilometers from the front who refused to accept that his armies couldn't hold everywhere simultaneously. Commanders in the field began to simply disobey. They'd report they were adjusting the line or conducting a tactical redeployment instead of saying retreat. The fiction preserved their positions. The reality saved their armies. Manstein had a heated confrontation with Hitler in January 1944. Army Group South was being pushed back toward the Dnieper River. Manstein had wanted to conduct a fighting withdrawal to a shorter, more defensible line. Hitler had insisted on holding forward positions. Manstein had finally spoken bluntly. Germany didn't have enough forces to defend the current line and maintain reserves. A choice had to be made: trade space for combat power or lose both. Hitler had responded that Manstein lacked offensive spirit, that he was too willing to retreat, that the problem was mindset, not mathematics. Manstein had left the meeting knowing he'd probably be relieved of command soon. He was right. By March, Hitler had replaced him with Model, who was more willing to attempt the impossible when ordered. But even Model couldn't change the fundamental equation. By spring 1944, Germany was losing the war production so badly that tactical skill couldn't compensate. The Soviets were fielding armies with thousands of tanks, supported by artillery concentrations that could reduce German positions to moonscapes. They were using tactics the Germans had pioneered: deep penetrations, encirclement, rapid exploitation, and they had the resources to sustain offensives for weeks, even months. When one Soviet army group exhausted itself, another would attack a different sector. The Germans never had time to rebuild reserves, never could concentrate forces decisively, never knew where the next blow would fall. Guderian watched this deterioration with growing alarm. As Inspector General of Armored Troops, he had access to production figures, loss rates, and training statistics. The numbers were catastrophic. Germany was producing hundreds of tanks per month. The Soviets were producing thousands. German tank crews were getting fewer training hours before being sent to the front. Soviet crews were better trained than they'd been in 1941. The qualitative advantage Germany had once enjoyed was evaporating, and the quantitative disadvantage was becoming overwhelming. Guderian tried to explain this to Hitler in multiple meetings. The Führer's response was always the same: build more tanks, fight harder, believe in victory. The breaking point came in summer 1944. Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive against Army Group Center, began on June 22nd, the third anniversary of Barbarossa. It was the most devastating defeat Germany suffered in the entire war. More catastrophic than Stalingrad. More complete than Kursk. In 5 weeks, the Soviets destroyed 28 divisions, killed or captured 400,000 German soldiers, and advanced 500 kilometers. Army Group Center essentially ceased to exist as a coherent force. The front line moved from eastern Belarus to the outskirts of Warsaw, and there was nothing Germany could do to stop it. Guderian, who'd been appointed Chief of the General Staff just days after Bagration began, would later call it worse than Stalingrad. At least Stalingrad had been one army in one city. Bagration destroyed an entire army group across a front hundreds of kilometers wide. The Soviets had used maskirovka, deception, to make the Germans expect the offensive in the south. They'd concentrated overwhelming force in the center, achieved complete surprise, and then exploited with a speed and coordination that shocked German commanders. This wasn't the Red Army of 1941, winning through mass and sacrifice. This was a sophisticated military machine executing complex operations with devastating effectiveness. Hitler's response to Bagration revealed how completely he'd lost touch with reality. He'd ordered the commanders of the encircled fortresses to hold in place. When they were overrun, he'd blamed them for insufficient determination. He demanded counterattacks with divisions that no longer existed. He'd raged at Guderian for presenting accurate casualty reports, accusing him of defeatism, and he'd insisted that the setback was temporary, that German forces would soon stabilize the line and resume offensive operations. Guderian had listened to these pronouncements with barely concealed contempt. He was 56 years old, a career officer who'd helped create modern armored warfare, and he was being lectured on military reality by a man whose understanding of the Eastern Front came from maps that bore no relation to actual conditions. The situation conferences after Bagration became increasingly surreal. Hitler would spend hours discussing plans for offensives with divisions that existed only on paper. He'd debate the defensive qualities of various river lines, while ignoring that Germany didn't have enough troops to defend any of them. He'd insist on holding cities for their symbolic value, while the armies defending them were being encircled and destroyed. And he'd explode in rage when anyone suggested that Germany's strategic position was untenable. Guderian attended these conferences with a sense of horrified fascination. He was watching a command structure collapse in real time, watching decisions being made that had no connection to military reality, watching a war being lost by a man who refused to acknowledge that losing was possible. Other officers in high command were reaching similar conclusions through different paths. Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff at OKW, had access to intelligence from all fronts. He could see that Germany was being crushed from all directions. Soviets from the east, Anglo-Americans from the west and south, bombing campaigns destroying industrial capacity, and the economy straining to support a military that was hemorrhaging men and equipment. Jodl was a loyal Nazi who'd supported Hitler's strategic decisions even when they defied military logic. But by late 1944, even he was presenting assessments that concluded Germany couldn't win. His solution was to seek a political settlement, to negotiate with either the Western Allies or the Soviets, to split the enemy coalition. Hitler had forbidden such discussions. Germany would fight until victory or annihilation. There was no middle ground. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of OKW, had become a figure of contempt among the officer corps. They called him Lecky Tell, a play on lackey because he never contradicted Hitler, never presented unwelcome facts, never advocated for military necessity over political demands. But even Keitel understood by autumn 1944 that the war was lost. He simply lacked the courage to say so and lacked the imagination to conceive of any action other than continued obedience. In meetings, he would nod along with Hitler's fantasies, agree that willpower would overcome material disadvantage, and then privately tell his staff that the situation was hopeless. His staff despised him for his cowardice. History would remember him as a yes-man who enabled catastrophe through weakness. The most dramatic confrontations came between Guderian and Hitler in the final months of the war. Guderian had accepted the position of Chief of the General Staff, knowing it was probably a death sentence. The previous occupant, Zeitzler, had suffered a nervous breakdown and been dismissed after repeatedly clashing with Hitler. But Guderian had believed he could make Hitler see reason through force of personality and blunt honesty. He'd been wrong. Their meetings became shouting matches. Guderian would present casualty figures, force ratios, and intelligence assessments, showing that Soviet offensives were inevitable and unstoppable. Hitler would accuse him of defeatism, cowardice, and treachery. Guderian would insist that Germany needed to evacuate forces from untenable positions to build reserves. Hitler would order those forces to hold in place and die there if necessary. In January 1945, the Soviets launched the Vistula Oder offensive. In 3 weeks, they advanced from Warsaw to within 60 kilometers of Berlin. They did this in the middle of winter, across terrain the Germans had assumed was impassable, with a speed that suggested the Red Army had learned everything about mobile warfare the Wehrmacht had once taught the world. Guderian had predicted the offensive. He'd warned Hitler it was coming. He'd begged for permission to withdraw forces from East Prussia and other exposed positions to create reserves that could counterattack. Hitler had refused. The forces in East Prussia would hold. There would be no retreat. The Soviets would exhaust themselves, and then Germany would counterattack. The Vistula Oder offensive destroyed that fantasy. Soviet forces bypassed German strong points, encircled resisting units, and drove west with multiple tank armies in parallel advances. German forces that could have been saved were trapped and destroyed because Hitler had forbidden withdrawal. Reserves that could have been created from those forces didn't exist, and the Red Army was now within striking distance of Berlin. Guderian had attended the Situation Conference on January 27th in a state of barely controlled fury. He'd presented the situation map showing Soviet penetrations. Hitler had dismissed it as exaggerated. Guderian had produced intelligence reports confirming Soviet strength. Hitler had called the reports fabricated. Guderian had finally lost his composure and shouted that the intelligence was accurate, that the situation was catastrophic, that Germany needed to make peace immediately before the Red Army reached Berlin. Hitler had screamed back that Guderian was a traitor, that he should be shot, that his defeatist attitude was the reason Germany was losing. The two men had stood face to face, both red-faced and shaking with rage, while the rest of the staff stood frozen in shock. Finally, Jodl had intervened, suggesting a break in the conference. Guderian had walked out, knowing his time was limited. You didn't shout at Hitler and survive long in your position, but he no longer cared. The war was lost, Berlin would fall. And the man responsible for the catastrophe was still giving orders as if willpower could stop Soviet tank armies. What's remarkable about this period is how many officers in German high command knew the war was lost but continued fighting. Some fought because they feared Soviet occupation more than continued war. Some fought because they'd sworn oaths and couldn't conceive of breaking them. Some fought because stopping seemed more impossible than continuing. And some fought because admitting defeat meant acknowledging that everything they'd done, every sacrifice they'd demanded, every order they'd given, had been for nothing. That psychological burden was heavier than the military situation. It was easier to keep fighting than to confront what fighting had cost. The final weeks brought a kind of madness to the command structure. Hitler was planning counter-offensives with armies that existed only in his imagination. He was moving divisions on maps without checking whether those divisions still existed. He was issuing orders to units that had been destroyed weeks earlier, and his staff was going through the motions of translating these fantasies into operational orders, knowing the orders would never be executed because the units didn't exist and the situation had moved beyond any possibility of control. Guderian was relieved of his position in late March. Hitler told him to go on sick leave. It was a polite fiction. They both knew he was being dismissed for telling the truth. By April 1945, the command structure had effectively collapsed. Hitler was in the Führerbunker in Berlin, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyalists, issuing orders to armies that couldn't receive them and wouldn't obey them if they could. Keitel and Jodl were still attending conferences, still pretending that the military situation could be managed, still maintaining the fiction that Germany was fighting a war rather than experiencing national suicide. And across what remained of German-held territory, field, commanders were making their own decisions, some fighting to the last, some seeking surrender terms, some trying to move west to surrender to the Anglo-Americans rather than the Soviets. The recognition that they couldn't stop the Red Army anymore had come to different men at different times. For Zeitzler, it had been Stalingrad. For Manstein, perhaps Kursk or the retreat across Ukraine. For Guderian, probably Bagration. For the delusional few like Keitel, maybe not until Soviet shells were falling on the Reich Chancellery. But by early 1945, every officer in German high command with functioning contact with reality understood that the war was over, that the Red Army would reach Berlin, that Germany would be occupied, and that everything they'd fought for was lost. What they said about this recognition varied. Some expressed it in operational terms, force ratios, supply situations, strategic assessments. Some expressed it emotionally. Despair, rage, resignation. Some never expressed it directly at all, communicating their understanding only through their actions or their silence. But the words that mattered most were the ones they didn't say. The counter-offensive plans they didn't propose. The optimistic assessments they didn't deliver. The promises of victory they stopped making. The silence in the map rooms when Hitler asked when the situation would be stabilized. That silence, more than any words, revealed that German high command understood they couldn't stop the Red Army anymore. Guderian would survive the war and write memoirs that tried to explain how Germany's military leadership had failed. He'd blame Hitler's interference, the lack of unified command, the diversion of resources to other fronts. All true, but he'd also admit in quieter moments that the generals had enabled Hitler's decisions, had executed his orders even when they knew those orders were catastrophic, had continued fighting long after the war was militarily lost. The recognition that they couldn't win had come years before the surrender, but recognition without action is just despair, and despair with continued obedience is complicity. The final assessment came from Jodl, who signed the surrender documents on May 7, 1945. A reporter asked him if Germany could have won the war. Jodl had paused, considering the question. Then he'd said simply, "No. Not after Stalingrad, not after Kursk. Probably not after the failure to take Moscow in 1941. Germany had fought a war it couldn't win against an enemy it couldn't defeat, and the recognition of that reality had come slowly, painfully, too late to matter. The Red Army had stopped being stoppable long before German high command stopped trying to stop it. And that gap between reality and recognition, between what was true and what could be admitted, had filled with the lives of millions.